My almond farm was burning down. I called my mother crying, but she coldly said, "Don't ruin your brother's birthday party. Deal with it yourself." 4 days later, my greedy family demanded my inheritance. I smiled and handed them my grandmother's secret will. They turned pale when the lawyer read it out loud. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." My name is Mara Whitlock. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I've worked on an almond farm in Fresno County, California. The night everything started falling apart, I wasn't thinking about family drama. I was thinking about irrigation schedules. That's the honest truth. It was a little after 1 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, so I was sitting at the kitchen table going over harvest projections for the 3rd time that week. Harvest season was getting close. On a farm, that means every decision suddenly feels expensive. My husband Ethan walked into the kitchen half asleep. "You coming to bed?" he asked. "In a minute. You said that 40 minutes ago." I smiled. He wasn't wrong. Then my phone rang. At first I thought it might be one of the field supervisors. Calls that late were never good news. I answered immediately. "Mara." The voice belonged to Carlos, one of our workers. His voice sounded strange, too fast, too loud. "Mara, you need to get here right now." My stomach dropped. What happened? "The storage building." A pause. "It's on fire." For a second, I honestly couldn't process the words. "What do you mean it's on fire?" "I mean it's burning." I was already grabbing my keys before he finished speaking. Ethan saw my face and immediately stood up. "What happened?" "The warehouse." That was all I managed to say. His expression changed instantly. We were in the truck less than a minute later. The drive felt endless, even though it normally took less than 15 minutes. The farther we got down the road, the more I could see orange light in the distance. I remember gripping the dashboard. Neither of us talked. We didn't need to. When we reached the property, flames were already shooting through the roof. The sight hit me like a punch. That building wasn't just another structure. It held equipment we'd spent years paying off, replacement parts, fertilizer, supplies for harvest, some early season inventory, thousands and thousands of dollars, maybe more. Firefighters were already working when we arrived. Someone pulled me back when I tried getting closer. "Ma'am, you need to stay behind the line." I stood there staring. The heat reached us even from a distance. I could hear metal popping inside the building. Every few seconds, another section collapsed. Ethan put a hand on my shoulder. I didn't realize I was shaking until then. "It's okay," he said quietly. No, it wasn't okay. But hearing him say it helped me stay standing. Over the next hour, more people started arriving. Not family, neighbors, farmers, people who understood exactly what a fire before harvest could mean. Old Mr. Reynolds came in his work truck. Then the Alvarez family. Nobody asked whether they were needed. They just showed up. One brought coffee, another brought bottled water. Someone helped Carlos move equipment that hadn't been damaged. Most of them had gotten out of bed because they heard another farmer was in trouble. The fire eventually came under control, but the damage was brutal. The roof was gone. The inside looked destroyed. I could already tell the insurance process would be a nightmare. As dawn approached, reality started replacing adrenaline. People began talking numbers, repair costs, replacement costs, lost inventory, lost time. Every estimate sounded worse than the one before it. Ethan spoke with firefighters and took notes. He stayed calm, focused, practical. Whenever somebody asked a question I couldn't answer, he stepped in. I don't know how I would have handled that night without him. Around 2:30, one of the firefighters gave us another update. The building was a total loss. There was no point pretending otherwise. I walked away from the group and sat on the tailgate of our truck. For the first time all night, I was alone. Smoke still hung in the air while red emergency lights flashed across the property. I pulled out my phone. There was one person I wanted to call. My mother. I stared at her name for several seconds before pressing call. The phone rang and rang. Finally, she answered. Hello? I took a shaky breath. Mom. For a second, all I could hear was music in the background, people laughing, glasses clinking. The sound was so normal that it felt disconnected from the scene around me. The warehouse was still smoking behind me. Firefighters were moving through the wreckage, and somehow my mother sounded like she was at a restaurant. Mara? She said. What's wrong? I swallowed hard. The storage building burned. What? The warehouse. We just lost it. There was a brief silence. Not the kind where someone is shocked. The kind where they're distracted. Then I heard someone in the background yell, Brandon's name. More cheering followed. My mother sighed. Oh, honey, this is really bad timing. I blinked. What? We're in the middle of Brandon's birthday dinner. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. The farm is on fire. I heard you. Mom, we lost the warehouse. Another sigh. A little louder this time. What exactly do you want me to do from here? The question hit harder than I expected. I wasn't asking her to put out the fire. I wasn't asking for money. I just wanted my mother. Just for a minute. I don't know, I said quietly. Maybe talk to me? Someone called her name again. She lowered her voice. Mara, we're celebrating. Brandon finally has everybody together for once. I stared at the burned building. The roof was gone. Parts of the wall were still collapsing. I really don't think tonight is the night to make everything about you. For a second I couldn't speak. Then she added the sentence I'll never forget. Don't ruin your brother's birthday party. Deal with it yourself. The line went dead. I just sat there staring at the screen. No goodbye. No. Are you okay? Nothing. A few minutes later, Ethan found me beside the truck. You talked to her? I nodded. How'd it go? I slipped my phone into my pocket. About how you'd expect. He looked at me for a second, then he wrapped an arm around my shoulder. He didn't ask any more questions. He already knew. The sun was coming up by the time most people finally headed home. Ethan and I stayed. There was paperwork to start, photos to take, insurance reports to document. The practical stuff doesn't stop just because you're exhausted. Around 7 in the morning, Mrs. Alvarez showed up again, this time carrying breakfast burritos. You two need to eat. We're fine, I said. She gave me a look. No, you're not. Then she handed me a burrito anyway. I ended up eating the entire thing. Over the next couple of days, people kept showing up. Not because they had to, because they wanted to help. A neighbor loaned us temporary storage space. Another farmer offered equipment we could use during harvest if repairs took too long. One local contractor moved us to the front of his schedule after hearing what happened. Nobody made a big speech about it. They just helped. That's what surprised me most. Meanwhile, my phone stayed silent. No call from Mom, no text from Dad, nothing from Brandon. At first I kept checking, then I stopped. On the second day, Ethan looked over from his laptop. Anyone reach out? I knew what he meant. I shook my head. No. He nodded once. That was it. Neither of us seemed surprised. The insurance adjuster arrived that afternoon. The preliminary estimates were ugly. Very ugly. I spent most of the meeting taking notes and trying not to react. Every new number felt like another punch. When the adjuster finally left, Ethan sat across from me at the kitchen table. We can rebuild. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I was tired. That's your motivational speech? It's a good one. It needs work. He grinned. Fair. For the first time in days, I smiled back. A small one. But still. The third day was mostly cleanup. The fourth day started the same way. Dust, Debris, contractors, phone calls, work, just work. I was helping Carlos sort damaged equipment when I heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. At first, I didn't pay attention. Vehicles came through all the time now. Then Carlos looked up. His expression changed. I turned around. A familiar black SUV was making its way down the farm road. My father's SUV. For a second, I actually felt relieved. Maybe they'd finally come. Maybe they realized how bad things were. Maybe they were here to help. I wiped my hands on my jeans and started walking toward the parking area as the SUV rolled to a stop. The driver's door opened. Then my father stepped out. Right behind him came my mother. And Brandon. All three of them. Together. None of them were carrying work gloves. That was the first thing I noticed. Not flowers, not coffee, just clean clothes and serious expressions. The relief I'd felt a few seconds earlier started fading. Mom gave me a quick hug. "You look tired." "Yeah." Dad looked toward the burned warehouse. "Damn." That was his entire reaction. Brandon adjusted his sunglasses. "So this is all from the fire?" Ethan walked over from the equipment shed and greeted everyone politely. Dad shook his hand. Mom smiled. Brandon barely acknowledged him. For a few minutes, we made awkward small talk about harvest season and contractors. Then Brandon asked his first real question. "The insurance is covering most of it, right?" "Hopefully." "What percentage?" "I don't know yet." Most people would have asked how we were doing. Brandon wanted numbers. A few minutes later, he asked about the total damage. When I told him estimates weren't finished, he exchanged a quick glance with Dad. Something about it bothered me. Ethan seemed to notice too. Dad cleared his throat. "So, what's the plan?" "We rebuild." "That expensive, huh?" "Yes. Fires usually are." Nobody laughed. Mom started talking about a restaurant she'd visited. Brandon checked his phone. Dad kept staring at the property. It felt less like a family visit and more like an inspection. As we walked around the damaged warehouse, Dad started asking about equipment, operating costs, and property boundaries. Questions he'd never cared about before. Not when I built the business. Not when Ethan and I expanded the farm. Suddenly, he was very interested. When Ethan stepped away to speak with a contractor, Brandon spoke up again. "Have you looked at the property value lately?" I stopped. "What?" "The land." "What about it?" He shrugged. "Just wondering." Dad jumped in. "Land prices have gone up a lot." I looked at both of them. This conversation wasn't random. They'd discussed it before coming here. Mom quickly changed the subject. "Have you been eating enough?" It sounded less like concern and more like a distraction. What struck me most was that nobody was talking about the fire anymore. The actual disaster had somehow become the least important topic. Ethan eventually returned and listened quietly. One look from him told me he was noticing the same thing. About half an hour later, they finally headed back to the SUV. Mom hugged me. Dad told me to keep them updated. Brandon opened the passenger door, then paused. "You know," he said, "Dad still thinks Grandma's estate wasn't handled fairly." The words landed hard. Nobody had mentioned Grandma Evelyn's inheritance in years. Dad didn't correct him. Mom suddenly found the parking lot very interesting. Brandon watched my face for a reaction. I didn't give him one. He nodded and climbed into the SUV. A minute later, they were gone. I stood there watching the dust trail disappear down the road. Ethan walked over beside me. "What was that about?" I let out a slow breath. "I think they're still talking about Grandma's will." "Still?" I nodded. "Apparently." Ethan looked toward the road where the SUV had disappeared, then back at the burned warehouse. The contrast was almost ridiculous. One disaster was sitting right in front of us. The other seemed determined to come back from the past. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan folded his arms. "I don't think they came here because of the fire." "No." I kept staring at the empty road. I don't think so either. And for the first time since the warehouse burned, my attention wasn't on what we'd lost. It was on why my family suddenly seemed interested in what I still owned. I think they're still talking about Grandma's will. The words stayed in my head long after Ethan and I went back to work. Not because Brandon had said something new, because he had confirmed something I already suspected. Some people never really let things go, especially when money is involved. I spent the rest of the afternoon helping contractors sort through salvageable equipment. Anything that survived the fire was being cleaned, documented, and moved into temporary storage. Normally, that kind of work kept my mind occupied. Not that day. Property values, insurance payouts, Grandma's estate. The conversation kept replaying in my head. By evening, I was exhausted. Ethan and I ate dinner at the kitchen counter. He was scrolling through insurance emails while I stared into a bowl of cold soup. "You haven't said 10 words in the last hour," he said. "I know. You want to talk about it?" I shrugged. "Not really." He laughed. "Which means yes." I smiled despite myself. "Do you ever notice how some families have one child they're always worried about?" Ethan looked up. Brandon. Brandon. He'd seen it for years. Brandon wasn't a bad person. He was charming and good with people. The problem was that everyone spent their lives cleaning up after him, especially my parents. Growing up, Brandon always seemed to land softly. I learned pretty early that I didn't. One memory came back to me. I was 16 when Grandma Evelyn let me help negotiate a small almond sale. I was proud of it. Dad barely looked at the paperwork. "You got your homework done?" That was his response. The same week, Brandon convinced our parents to fund another business idea. Dad spent the entire dinner talking about how entrepreneurial he was. Grandma noticed things like that. She always noticed. When I was a teenager, she'd sometimes hand me a lemonade after a long day in the fields and say, "People reveal what they value by where they spend their attention." I understand that now. The farm still needed attention whether I was dealing with a fire or not. While checking irrigation reports the next morning, my phone buzzed. For a second I thought it might be Mom. It wasn't. Mrs. Alvarez was organizing volunteers to help clear debris around the warehouse site. Nobody had asked them to do that. They just cared. By Saturday morning, nearly a dozen people showed up. Some brought trucks. Others brought tools. One retired farmer spent half the morning telling terrible jokes while helping move scrap metal. For a few hours, things almost felt normal. At lunch, everyone gathered around folding tables near the equipment shed. The conversation stayed focused on weather, harvest forecasts, and local gossip. Nobody talked about inheritance or family drama. It was refreshing. At one point, Mr. Reynolds looked at me. "Your grandmother would have been proud seeing this." "Thank you." He nodded. "She always knew you'd be the one running this place." The comment stayed with me. Later that afternoon, I went into the old farmhouse office looking for storage records. Boxes and folders were stacked everywhere. While searching through a cabinet, an old notebook slipped off a shelf. I recognized it immediately. Grandma Evelyn's handwriting was on the cover. I hadn't seen it in years. As I picked it up, a folded piece of paper slid from between the pages. A handwritten note. Grandma's handwriting. The date at the top caught my attention. It had been written only a few months before her will was read. Slowly, I unfolded the paper. The note wasn't long. It wasn't some dramatic confession or secret legal document. It looked more like something Grandma Evelyn had written for herself. Most of it talked about the farm, water management, crop rotation, equipment maintenance. Then one sentence caught my attention. Character always reveals itself when there's something valuable to gain. I read it twice. The timing bothered me. She'd written it only months before her will was read. I folded the paper and slipped it back into the notebook. That evening, I brought it home. Ethan was reviewing contractor estimates when I handed it to him. He read the line and nodded. Sounds like your grandmother. Exactly. She wasn't usually wrong about people. The more I thought about Brandon's comment, the more memories resurfaced. Back then, I spent almost every weekend helping Grandma. Some kids played sports. I learned irrigation schedules. By the time I was in college, she trusted me with responsibilities most people wouldn't give a teenager. She treated me like I was capable. That mattered. Grandma understood every part of the business, the crops, the contracts, the finances. Watching her work was better than any class I ever took. Ironically, that's also how I met Ethan. He worked as a consultant for agricultural businesses. The first time we met, he showed up wearing expensive boots that had obviously never touched a field. I noticed immediately. Those boots are brand new. He looked down. So? Walk through that orchard and they won't be. He laughed. A few hours later, he was helping inspect irrigation lines. By the end of the day, the boots were covered in dirt. That's when I started liking him. Not because he impressed me, because he never acted like he was above the work. Over the next year, we kept finding reasons to spend time together. For the first time in my life, I was around someone who genuinely respected what I did. That was new. When Ethan proposed, we got married right there on the farm. Simple ceremony. Family. Friends. Nothing fancy. One moment from that day still stands out. Dad spent nearly 20 minutes talking about Brandon's latest business idea. At my wedding. I remember catching Ethan's eye. He just smiled. He already understood how things worked. Years passed. The farm grew slowly but steadily. Meanwhile, Brandon continued bouncing between projects. Every holiday seemed to include another business opportunity and another explanation for why the last one failed. Mom and Dad always believed the next venture would be different. Then Grandma's health started declining. Eventually, she passed away peacefully. Losing her felt like losing the foundation of the family. The arguments came later. A few weeks after the funeral, everyone gathered at the attorney's office for the reading of her estate documents. The room was quiet. Everyone seemed nervous. But there was also an expectation hanging in the air. Nobody said it directly. They didn't have to. Everyone assumed the assets would be divided equally. The house, the farmland, the investment accounts, everything. Dad looked confident. Mom seemed relaxed. Brandon was practically smiling. The attorney opened the file and turned a page. Then he adjusted his glasses and began reading the section identifying the beneficiary. The room went completely silent. And then he said my name. Just hearing it changed the entire room. Nobody argued immediately. Dad blinked. Mom stared at the attorney. Brandon looked genuinely confused. For a few seconds, everyone seemed to be waiting for the rest of the sentence. Another beneficiary. Another surprise. There wasn't. The attorney calmly continued explaining the trust. Grandma had created it years earlier. Everything had been finalized. And because it was an irrevocable trust, challenging it would be extremely difficult. I remember looking down at the paperwork. Not because I was excited, because I suddenly felt overwhelmed. Owning the farm wasn't a prize. It was a responsibility. When the meeting ended, Brandon barely said goodbye. Dad shook my hand. Actually shook my hand, like we were business associates, not father and daughter. Mom hugged me, but it felt distracted. Everyone left carrying different emotions. Mine wasn't happiness, it was pressure. The following year was one of the hardest of my life. People imagine inheritance solves problems. It doesn't. It simply gives you different ones. The farm needed investment. Equipment was aging. Parts of the irrigation system were outdated. The numbers were intimidating. Some nights, Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by spreadsheets until midnight. One evening, I looked at him. What if we're not ready for this? He leaned back. Nobody's ready the first time. That's not reassuring. It wasn't supposed to be. That made me laugh. The first major decision involved replacing part of the irrigation network. The cost made me nauseous. I reviewed the estimates over and over. Eventually, Ethan pushed the paperwork toward me. "You already know what needs to happen." He was right. So we moved forward. Then came another project. And another. For a while, it felt like every dollar we earned went straight back into the farm. Progress happened slowly, but it happened. Yields improved, costs dropped, new contracts followed, small wins, the kind nobody celebrates except the people doing the work. What surprised me most wasn't the business growth. It was the community. When equipment broke down, neighbors helped. When harvest schedules became chaotic, people stepped in. One year, a mechanical failure threatened part of our harvest. Before we even asked, 2 neighboring farmers offered equipment. No contracts, no negotiations, just help. The farming community became family, not the family I was born into, the family that showed up. Meanwhile, things with my parents grew colder. Nothing dramatic, just distance. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. Whenever conversations drifted toward the farm, tension followed. Brandon's business ventures continued the same cycle. Excitement, investment, problems, failure, repeat. Every time one collapsed, somebody eventually mentioned Grandma's estate. Enough for me to notice, enough for Ethan to notice too. One evening, after an awkward holiday dinner, Ethan glanced over at me. "They're still angry." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't think they're upset about the money." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I think they're upset Grandma made a choice." Deep down, I thought he might be right. Years passed. The farm grew stronger. Then the fire happened. The memories faded as I returned to the present. I was standing in the farmhouse office with Grandma's notebook beside me. Outside, workers were moving debris. I picked up my phone. 3 missed calls. All from Brandon. That was unusual. We rarely spoke more than a few times a year. Then another message appeared. And another. The final text was longer. I opened it. "Dad wants to talk about Grandma's estate. Call me when you can." I stared at the screen. The warehouse had burned less than a week ago, and somehow they were talking about the inheritance again. I stared at Brandon's message for almost a minute before replying. Not because I didn't understand what he wanted. Because I understood it perfectly. The warehouse had burned less than a week ago. Contractors were everywhere. Insurance paperwork covered my desk. And somehow my father's biggest concern was Grandma Evelyn's estate. I texted back. "What exactly does Dad want to discuss?" The reply came almost immediately. "It's complicated. Just call me." Whenever Brandon said something was complicated, it usually meant he didn't want to put it in writing. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang. "Brandon," I answered. "Hey." Finally. "What's going on?" He sounded unusually friendly. Too friendly. "You've been busy?" "My warehouse burned down, Brandon." "Right, of course." A brief silence followed. Then he cleared his throat. "So, Dad's been thinking." That sentence never led anywhere good. About what? The farm? The trust? Everything. There it was. Straight to the point. What about it? Well, maybe everybody should sit down and have a conversation. We've already had conversations. Not recently. There's a reason for that. Another pause. Dad thinks the situation created a divide in the family. The situation? The inheritance. Of course. Always the inheritance. Not Grandma. Not the years she spent building the farm. Just the inheritance. The trust was settled years ago, I said. I know. So what are we discussing? Fairness. I almost laughed. Nobody talked about fairness when my parents were funding Brandon's failed business ideas. Nobody talked about fairness when Grandma spent years teaching me how to run the farm. Now suddenly, Everyone cared about fairness. "What specifically are you asking for?" I said. Instead of answering, Brandon asked another question. "Do you know what the property is worth now?" There it was again. Property value. Not crops. Not recovery plans. Not the fire. Money. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious." "No, you're not." His patience cracked. "Why are you being defensive?" "Because you've asked about insurance, land values, trust assets, and inheritance more times this week than you've asked how I'm doing." Silence. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded colder. "Dad feels like Grandma made the wrong decision." There it is. What does that mean? It means we're finally being honest. Another pause. Then Brandon said something that caught my attention. "You know, legally there might have been other options." I sat upright. "What options?" "Nothing specific." "Then why say it?" He sighed. "I'm just saying families sometimes work things out privately." That sounded rehearsed. Not like Brandon. Like Dad. The realization settled in quietly. For years, Brandon had been the messenger. Dad was usually the one behind the message. I ended the call a few minutes later. Politely. When Ethan came into the office, he immediately noticed my expression. "That bad?" I handed him the phone. "Read the messages." He scanned them, then looked up. "Interesting?" "That's one word for it." He sat across from me. Outside, a tractor started up. Normally, the sound was comforting. Today it wasn't. "What do you think they're doing?" I asked. "I think they're testing boundaries." "Meaning?" "They want to see if you're willing to reopen something that was settled years ago." I knew he was probably right. The problem was how specific Brandon's questions had become. Property values, trust structures, asset growth. It sounded like somebody had been doing homework. And that bothered me. A lot. Ethan leaned forward. "Have you talked to the attorneys who handled Evelyn's trust recently?" "No." "Maybe it's time." "You think this is serious?" "I think your father has spent years being unhappy about that trust." He paused. "And now they're bringing it up while you're dealing with a major crisis." I looked at Grandma's notebook on the desk, the same one that contained her handwritten note. Character always reveals itself when there's something valuable to gain. Ethan tapped the desk. "I think we should call the law firm." I looked at him. "The one Grandma used?" He nodded. For the first time since Brandon's calls started, the decision felt obvious. I reached for my phone and searched for the attorney's number. I found the attorney's number faster than I expected. Apparently, I had never deleted it. That alone felt strange. Years had passed since Grandma Evelyn's estate had been settled. Back then, I assumed I would never need to revisit any of it. Now I was sitting in a temporary office beside a burned warehouse, scrolling through legal contacts I hadn't touched in years. Life has a weird sense of timing. Ethan was already opening file cabinets. "If we're doing this," he said, "let's do it properly." I nodded. That was exactly how he approached everything. No panic, no drama, just a plan. Within an hour, the farmhouse office looked worse than it had after the fire. Boxes covered the floor. Folders sat stacked across tables. Old binders appeared from cabinets I hadn't opened in years. Most of the documents dated back to Grandma's final years. Trust paperwork, property records, tax filings, equipment inventories. I had seen some of it before, not all of it. At one point, Ethan held up a thick binder. "Did you ever read this?" I looked over. "No." "What is it?" "Trust administration records." I laughed. "That sounds exciting." "You're missing out." For the first time all week, we both smiled. The moment didn't last long. The deeper we dug into the paperwork, the more obvious something became. Grandma had been incredibly organized. Every major decision had documentation. Every transfer, every property adjustment, every legal review. Nothing appeared rushed. Nothing looked questionable. If anything, she had prepared for challenges long before they ever happened. That realization was strangely comforting. It also made Brandon's recent behavior feel even more suspicious. A few hours later, my phone rang. The law firm. I put the call on speaker. A woman named Karen introduced herself and confirmed she still had access to the estate files. That surprised me. Even after all these years? I asked. Absolutely, she said. We maintain complete archives. I glanced at Ethan. That was good news. Very good news. Karen spent several minutes reviewing basic details. The trust, the beneficiary designation, the transfer timeline. Everything matched what I already remembered. Then she said something that immediately got my attention. It appears your grandmother's attorneys anticipated the possibility of future disputes. I sat up straighter. What do you mean? There are extensive supporting records explaining the estate structure. Ethan stopped sorting papers. Neither of us interrupted. Karen continued. The files are unusually detailed. That sounded exactly like Grandma. If she believed something was important, she documented it. Carefully, thoroughly, sometimes excessively. The call lasted nearly 40 minutes. By the end, we had scheduled an in-person meeting for later that week. Once I hung up, Ethan leaned back in his chair. Feel better? A little. And I did. For the first time since Brandon's call started, the situation felt manageable. Not because the conflict was gone, because facts existed, documents existed, records existed. The conversation was slowly shifting away from emotion and toward evidence. That mattered. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of paperwork. Several times I found documents I didn't even remember receiving. Old correspondence, property evaluations, legal summaries. Most of it wasn't dramatic, just thorough. The kind of paperwork people ignore until they suddenly need it. Around sunset, I discovered a sealed folder tucked inside one of Grandma's filing cabinets. The label caught my attention immediately. Estate planning materials. I carried it to the desk. Ethan looked over. Something interesting? Maybe. Inside were copies of documents I'd seen before. Trust records, property schedules, attorney correspondence. Then I noticed something else. A separate reference sheet attached near the back. I didn't recognize it. That was unusual. I flipped through the pages. Nothing jumped out immediately. Still, the folder felt different somehow. Important. I added it to the growing stack for the meeting. A little later, my phone buzzed again. Karen from the law firm had sent a confirmation email. I opened it. Most of it contained scheduling details, meeting time, office address, required documents, normal stuff. Then I reached the final paragraph. I read it once. Then again. Ethan noticed. What is it? I slowly lowered the phone. Karen says there's another document in Grandma's estate file. His eyebrows lifted. What kind of document? I looked back at the email. The answer wasn't included. Only one sentence. A sentence that suddenly made our upcoming meeting feel much more important. There is one additional document we believe should be reviewed during the appointment. Dad arrived 10 minutes early. That alone told me he was nervous. My father had spent most of his life making other people wait for him. Showing up early wasn't his style, neither was pacing. But when Ethan and I walked into the conference room, that's exactly what he was doing. Brandon sat beside him scrolling through his phone. Mom wasn't there. Part of me wasn't surprised. She had become very good at avoiding uncomfortable situations. The law firm's conference room looked exactly the way I remembered. Neutral walls. Large table. Too much coffee. Too much silence. Nobody seemed interested in small talk. Brandon stood when we entered. Hey. Hey. That was the entire conversation. Ethan took the seat beside me. Dad sat across from us. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the attorney entered carrying several folders. Karen followed behind him with additional documents. The meeting officially began. The lead attorney, Mr. Hargrove, spent the first few minutes reviewing basic estate information. Most of it wasn't new. Dates, trust formation records, property transfers, administrative timelines. Still, Dad listened carefully. More carefully than I'd ever seen him listen to anything involving the farm. When the review ended, he finally spoke. I still believe the distribution was unfair. The room became quiet. Mr. Hargrove nodded politely. I understand that's your position. Dad folded his arms. It divided the family. The attorney didn't react. Instead, he opened a file. The trust became effective years ago. A page turned. All notification requirements were satisfied. Another page. The statutory period for filing objections expired long ago. Dad's expression tightened. What if important information wasn't considered? It was. What if the decision itself was unreasonable? Mr. Hargrove calmly folded his hands. That's not a legal standard for overturning an irrevocable trust. The sentence landed heavily. For the first time since arriving, Dad didn't have an immediate response. I noticed Brandon looking down at the table, not angry, worried. That caught my attention, because Brandon usually acted confident during family conflicts. Today he looked uncomfortable, almost anxious. The discussion continued for nearly half an hour. Question after question, answer after answer. Every road seemed to lead to the same conclusion. The trust was valid. The deadlines had passed. The documentation was complete. There wasn't much room for interpretation. Eventually, Dad stopped arguing and started searching for openings. Small technical questions, hypothetical scenarios, alternative possibilities. The attorneys answered all of them, patiently, thoroughly, and every answer pointed in the same direction. Nothing about the estate appeared vulnerable. I felt something shift inside the room. Not dramatically. Just enough. For most of my life, Dad had controlled family conversations. He decided what mattered. He decided when discussions ended. People usually adjusted around him. That wasn't happening here. Facts were controlling the conversation. Not personalities, not pressure. Facts. For once, that worked in my favor. At one point, Brandon finally spoke. What if everyone agreed to revisit things privately? The question sounded familiar, almost identical to something he'd said during our phone call. Mr. Hargrove looked at him. You're free to have any private conversation you'd like. A brief pause. But legally speaking, ownership is not in dispute. Brandon leaned back. His jaw tightened. Nobody said anything for several seconds. The silence felt different now. Less confident, less hopeful. As the meeting moved toward its conclusion, I expected everyone to stand up and leave. Instead, Mr. Hargrove opened another folder, a different one. The room immediately caught my attention. Karen glanced toward him, then toward Dad. The change was subtle, but noticeable. Dad seemed to notice it too. What is that? He asked. Mr. Hargrove rested his hand on the folder. There is one additional matter. I exchanged a look with Ethan. Neither of us spoke. The attorney opened the folder slowly. Inside was a sealed envelope, a very old envelope, yellowed slightly with age. My stomach tightened. I had never seen it before. Apparently neither had Brandon. Dad stared at it. What is that? Mr. Hargrove looked directly at him. Your mother left this with our office. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The room had become completely silent. The attorney continued. She instructed us to retain it with the estate records. Dad's face changed. Just slightly. Enough for me to notice. For me? He asked. Mr. Hargrove nodded. Yes. Then he carefully slid the envelope across the table. A personal letter from Evelyn. And suddenly, nobody seemed interested in the trust anymore. Gerald didn't reach for the letter right away. That surprised me. For weeks, maybe years, he'd acted like he wanted answers. Now the answers were sitting directly in front of him, and suddenly he looked hesitant. The attorney slid the envelope across the table. "This was left with the trust documents," he said. "Mrs. Evelyn Whitlock instructed us to keep it sealed unless questions about her intentions ever arose." Nobody spoke. Even Brandon looked uncomfortable. Finally, Dad opened the envelope and unfolded the pages. The room was silent except for the sound of paper. His expression changed as he read. His jaw tightened. Mom leaned closer. "What does it say?" Dad didn't answer. The attorney cleared his throat. "If you prefer, I can read it aloud." For a moment I thought Gerald might refuse. Instead, he handed over the pages. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began. "Gerald," he read, "if you are hearing this letter, it means people are questioning why I made the choices I made." The room somehow became even quieter. "I want there to be no confusion. I did not leave the farm, land, and trust assets to Mara by accident. I did it because she spent years proving she understood the responsibility that came with them." I felt my chest tighten. The attorney continued. "She learned every part of this operation. She showed up when nobody was watching. She worked when there was no reward waiting. She earned my trust long before she inherited it. Then came the part that changed everything. Gerald, I love you. But loving someone does not require ignoring their mistakes." Dad's eyes dropped toward the table. "You spent years treating Brandon's potential as more important than Mara's effort. You celebrated promises and overlooked consistency. You offered one child endless second chances while expecting the other to quietly carry responsibility." Mom looked down. Brandon stared at the floor. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't the only person who had seen it. Grandma had seen it too. Every ignored accomplishment. Every time my work was treated as ordinary while Brandon's latest idea became family news. The attorney turned another page. "Mara does not need this letter to validate her worth. But perhaps the rest of you need it to understand my decision." I swallowed hard. For years I'd wondered if I was imagining it. Apparently not. Grandma had noticed everything. The attorney finished reading. Then the room fell silent. No arguments, no accusations, just silence. Brandon was the first to speak. "She really wrote that?" The attorney nodded. "Yes." Dad remained motionless. For someone who always controlled conversations, he suddenly had nothing to say. A strange feeling settled over me. Not victory. Relief. Years of trying to explain myself suddenly felt unnecessary. The person who mattered most had already understood. Ethan reached over and squeezed my hand. I squeezed back. The attorney finally spoke. "As discussed, the trust remains fully valid. Nothing in today's meeting changes its legal status." Nobody challenged him, because there was nothing left to challenge. Dad finally looked at me. For a moment I thought he might apologize. Instead, he simply nodded. A small, tired nod. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Outside, Brandon stopped beside his truck. "Mara." I turned. "I didn't know she wrote that." "I know." He looked like he wanted to say more. Then he shook his head and climbed into the vehicle. A minute later, he was gone. Mom and Dad left separately. Ethan and I stood in the parking lot watching the cars disappear. "How are you feeling?" he asked. I thought about it. "Lighter." He smiled. "Good." For the first time since the fire, I actually meant it. Months passed. The warehouse rebuild moved forward. Insurance claims were settled. Harvest season came and went. Life slowly returned to normal. Then, one afternoon, a handwritten letter arrived at the farmhouse. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Mom's, Denise. I opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a short apology. Not perfect, not dramatic, but real. For the first time, she acknowledged the phone call during the fire. She even admitted she'd treated Brandon and me differently. I finished reading and sat quietly for several minutes. Then my phone buzzed. A local farmer had sent me a news article. The message was short. "Thought you should see this." I opened the link. The article was about Brandon, and judging by the headline, whatever had happened was serious. I opened the article and immediately wished I hadn't, not because it was shocking, because it was familiar. Brandon's latest business venture had collapsed. Again. This time it involved a distribution company he'd started with 2 investors from Sacramento. According to the article, the company had accumulated significant debt before shutting down. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, just bad decisions, poor planning, and unpaid obligations. The same cycle I'd watched for years, only now it was public. I put my phone down and stared out the kitchen window. A few minutes later, Ethan walked in. "Well?" I handed him the phone. He read the article, then sighed. "That's rough." "Yeah." Neither of us said much. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel angry. I just felt tired. A few days later, Brandon called. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. "Hey," I answered. His voice sounded different, less confident. "Hey." An awkward silence followed. Then he laughed softly. "You probably saw the article." "I did." "Figures." For once, Brandon didn't launch into excuses, didn't blame investors, didn't blame the market. He just sounded defeated. "I messed up," he finally said. "Yeah." Another silence. Then he surprised me. "Grandma was probably right." Hearing Brandon say that felt stranger than hearing Evelyn's letter. "You know," he continued, "for years I convinced myself she chose you because she loved you more." My grip tightened slightly on the phone. "But that's not really it, is it?" "No," I said quietly. "No." That conversation didn't magically fix anything. We didn't suddenly become close. But it was probably the most honest conversation we'd had in 20 years. A few weeks later, Mom visited the farm. Actually visited. Not for a meeting, not for an argument. Just a visit. She brought coffee, which somehow felt significant. We walked along one of the orchard roads while workers prepared equipment nearby. The conversation was awkward at first. Eventually, she stopped walking. I should have answered that call differently. I knew exactly which call she meant. The one from the night of the fire. I looked out toward the trees. "Yeah," I said. "You should have." Her eyes watered slightly. Mine didn't. Not because I was angry, because too much time had passed. Some things can be forgiven without being forgotten. She nodded. "I know." That was enough. Not a perfect ending, just an honest moment. By late summer, construction on the new warehouse was finally complete. The first time I saw it finished, I stood there longer than necessary. It was larger than the old one, safer, better designed. Workers moved equipment inside while trucks rolled across the yard. The place felt alive again. One morning before sunrise, Ethan and I stood near the loading area watching the season's first major harvest shipment arrive. The air smelled like dust, almonds, and fresh lumber. Forklifts moved back and forth. People laughed. Someone yelled for more pallets. Normal farm chaos. The best kind. Ethan bumped my shoulder. "You did it." I laughed. "We did it." Fair correction. Nearby, Mr. Reynolds was arguing with Carlos about whose coffee tasted worse. The Alvarez family was helping coordinate deliveries. Several neighbors who had shown up the night of the fire were standing in the building that replaced what we had lost. I looked around and realized something. The faces that mattered most weren't sitting in attorney offices. They weren't arguing about inheritance. They were right here, working, helping, showing up. The same way they always had. As the first load of harvest rolled into the new warehouse, I found myself thinking about Grandma Evelyn, about all those years in the orchards. One memory came back clearly. She once told me that people reveal themselves when something valuable is at stake. Back then, I thought she was talking about money. Now I don't think she was. I watched another truck pull into the yard. Workers waved it forward. The warehouse doors stood open. Ready for another season. Ready for whatever came next. And standing there, watching the harvest move inside, I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. The people who become family aren't always the ones who share your name. Sometimes they're the people who show up while the fire is still burning, not the ones who arrive later to calculate what was left behind. Before I end this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had someone support you when you needed them most, and someone else disappoint you when you thought they never would? Let me know in the comments. I'd genuinely like to read your experiences.